So good afternoon, everyone. I can finally say the one thing I know how to say in Swedish, which is tack så mycket. So I would like to thank Arkitekts Sweden, particularly Tove, for this really kind invitation. It's an absolute honor for me to speak here. Stockholm is actually one of my favorite cities, and I say that genuinely. Today's talk is going to be quite a short one, which is both good news and bad news. And I will start with the bad news first, because change and transformation are enormous, complex, and often very emotional subjects. 20 minutes is not long enough to do justice to the topic, but the good news is that editing is a very good way to cut the excess from your ideas and thoughts until only the essential message remains. And I often think of this process as burnishing or polering, which Google Translate has helpfully supplied, and I hope it is correct. So what you're going to see and hear in the next 20 minutes is a series of 5 scenarios, sacred cows, that seem to me to be the most significant areas that need attention if this project of transformation is ever to be achieved. I would also like to make it clear that I'm speaking today from the perspective of an educator, not a practitioner. It has taken me a while to both understand and accept that in my practice, as an architect, I build knowledge and institutions, not buildings per se. I also come from the world's youngest continent, Africa, where the average age is under 20, half that of Europe and the United States, and a decade younger than Asia. So for us, education is both a natural territory and a battlefield. One man's truth is another man's poison, or so the saying goes. One of the most important lessons I have learned over the past 58 years, and it was my 58th birthday on Tuesday, so finally I can say 58 and not nearly 58, is that two people can see the same event and understand two things completely differently, and that both, to a certain extent, are true. In other words, we experience the world through the lens or the prism of our own perspectives, which are in turn shaped by our experiences, both as individuals, but also as members of much larger affiliations, such as community, culture, and citizenship. So I often think of the first sacred cow as truth. If we accept, as I think most of us do, that both the discipline and the profession of architecture need transformation, one of the first questions to ask ourselves is what we mean when we say change. The past 2 years have been difficult. That statement needs no editing. And by and large, I would say that the response of the global architectural community has largely been one of confusion. Institutions everywhere have struggled with internal anxiety and public vulnerability, torn between a desire to do the right thing, or at least to be seen to be doing the right thing, without any real clarity on what that might look like, or whose responsibility it is to bring it about. In many schools of architecture particularly, there's a deepening realization that the answers we seek are more complex and structural than we may have anticipated, and that new alliances will have to be made with ourselves, with our others, with different knowledge systems and ways of seeing and being in the world, if we are to gain the trust of those who need it the most, the young, the current generation of students, citizens, activists, and new academics who will inherit the earth. Architecture is only one of the many lenses through which we understand the world, yet its impact is profound. From public health to private wealth, from historical analysis to avant-garde notions about the future and the world to come, it is a uniquely broad and ambitious discipline that allows us to confront what we already know, yet at the same time imagine what we don't know. Throughout the history of architectural education, schools have been at the vanguard of the potentially dynamic intersection between past and future. But now we find ourselves increasingly stuck in the present moment, unable to look back for fear of what we failed to see, and unable to look forward for fear of what we may find.
This is, is, 1 of the silos that was built by Kwame Nkrumah. 1 of the silos that was built by Kwame Nkrumah. 1 of the silos that was built by Kwame Nkrumah. 1 of the silos that was built by Kwame Nkrumah. 1 of the silos that was built by Kwame Nkrumah. 1 of the silos that was built by Kwame Nkrumah. 1 of the silos that was built by Kwame Nkrumah. 1 of the silos that was built by Kwame Nkrumah. 1 of the silos that was built by Kwame Nkrumah. 1 of the silos that was built by Kwame Nkrumah. 1 of the silos that was built by Kwame Nkrumah. 1 of the silos that was built by Kwame Nkrumah. 1 of the silos that was built by Kwame Nkrumah. 1 of the silos that was built by Kwame Nkrumah. 1 of the silos that was built by Kwame Nkrumah. 1 of the silos that was built by Kwame Nkrumah. 1 of the silos that was built by Kwame Nkrumah. 1 of the si This is a building from the 60s, which is lost in time, and then we are trying to excavate it in order to be able to produce new futures. We are trying to open up the discourse in terms of art. How do we go back to like this, the idea of the ground zero, the bottom line, in order to be able to find new forms of inspiration that somehow includes everyone?
Human history is about the future. Whiteness is about entrapment. Whiteness is at its best when it turns into a myth. It is at its most corrosive and most lethal when it makes us believe that it is everywhere, that everything originates from it, and that it has no outside. Democracy will either be built on the ruins of those versions of whiteness that produce men like Cecil Rhodes, or it will fail. In other words, whiteness must be recalled and decommissioned if we are to put history to rest, to free ourselves from our own entrapment and open a future for all of us here and now. It might be then that the statue of Rhodes and others properly belong to a museum. Yet a museum, properly understood, is not a dumping place. It is not a place where we recycle history's waste. It is first and foremost an epistemic space. A stronger option would be the creation of a new kind of institution, perhaps part park, part graveyard, where statues of the people who spent most of their lives defacing everything that the name Black stood for would be put to rest. Putting them to rest in these new places would in turn allow us to move on and recreate new public spaces that are required for our new democratic project.
Bring me my children, let them come and sit at my feet. I want to tell them magnificent tales of how their fathers were heroes, paint them a portrait of Isandlwane, then take them to Al Obeid and Sheikh Khan. I want to journey with them to the beautiful forgotten lands. My children need to know that we have our own epic stories.
So in bringing together this panel of speakers with their diverse disciplinary backgrounds, interests, and differing modes of practice, we were really interested in a range of disciplines that are somehow peripheral to architecture, like poetry, like psychology, like performance. Disciplines that are not really at the center of architecture, but have an enormous amount to contribute to it. So the idea of forgetting architecture came about because we wanted to forget the primary role of architecture and look to other disciplines.
I would say that this kind of situation are very important for the students to understand how thinking differently is important to guide an alternative way of designing reality. So I would stress this kind of situation where, let's say, theoretical seminars and mid-term corrections and dialogue on projects join together, just to let them feel that the thinking and doing is the same things. I still think that we are living in a kind of a zero-degree age where all the things are not clear, and the burden will be clear probably in 2 generations. So we are entering a completely new phase, which is not at the 0 degree of modernists. We are not heroes anymore. We're just cleaning the soil to prepare the next seeding for the next generation.
I was able to post a few of the videos that people had posted on Instagram. And I received a text message at about midnight from my daughter. And she said, "Dad, this is scary." I said, "You know, it's not as scary as the world we're living in." And she said, "But how did it feel? What were people's reaction?" I said, it was very comfortable for me inside, and I think it may have been unsettling for people outside, you know. And in that moment, I knew that I had created a space for me. All of that is an effort for me to figure out another way to remember.
Conversations like the ones that took place at Forgetting Architecture I think are a very powerful way of remembering that education is far more than the list of learning outcomes prescribed in any given degree. It's also the unexpected encounters, knowledge and discussions that happen when talented students and critical thinkers come together. And that's how we expand our understanding of the fields in which we're engaged. That's how knowledge is produced.
How many of us would say, of course I saw the plane goes into the tower? No, you didn't, because no one filmed the tower. But our almost national memory, it's embedded so deeply within our memories.
I'm now carrying a sense of responsibility to continue this kind of work beyond where it is now. And I think it's really important that in the next phase of the GSA, we start to develop a criticality and a sense of reflection about what the project we're doing here is and how we take that forward.
And this is what we found, an inventory of feminist upheaval.
Was anarchy merely an expression of love and care?
The methods of struggle are improvised in the cell, improvised in the air, improvised from nothing.
The reformers and the journalists didn't know.
They didn't know that the hallway and stairwell were places of assembly, or that you love in doorways.
Feminists are activists.
The riot is like a general strike, a bridge between now and the free territory.
The riot seeks to preserve nothing.
规制手下两只，第二只是有钱猫。
The enclosure provides the field for heroic deeds.
Mosadi o tshwara thipa ka bohale.
Le mpi imayelana namantombazana amancane azoba nenkinga efana neyami.
They dream a new set of arrangements. They dream the end of involuntary servitude.
What did she think of herself? Not much, or quite a lot, depending how you looked at it.
We are not what other people say we are. We are who we know ourselves to be. We are what we love. That's okay.
What we stand on is not masonry.
It is the torn place, unhealed.
Hila izilonda zingapholi khona. Hila izilonda zingapholi khona.
My favorite expression over the past 6 months has been, next time I say I'm going to open a school of architecture, please shoot me. I promise you it is only half said in jest. The African Futures Institute is an institution that is still very much in the making, still very much in progress, without any real template or precedent. It owes much to multiple small and often independent schools of architecture that have emerged over the past 70-odd years around the world. It also owes a lot to the Radical Pedagogies project begun by Beatrice Colomina at Princeton University, not so much in terms of its structure or curriculum or even its ambitions, but more in the idea of a radix, an experimental rhizome of ideas and perspectives brought together in a single place, the institute or the program, and in our case, through our network of talks, courses, and research. The AFI's big design project, and this is becoming clearer to me every day, isn't so much the design of a space, a building, or a program, or even a school. It is broader than that, and is therefore much harder to describe.
It's not about architecture, it's about urbanism. And it's about what we do with our cities, it's about how we deploy them, it's about scale, it's about governance, it's about sustainability. And we have to totally rethink the whole process. I recently realized that I'm not the future anymore.
The difficulty in describing the African Futures Institute comes down to the difference between two words, exploration and explanation. And to explain this a little bit more clearly, I'm going to step sideways to literature and to one novel in particular, Elizabeth Costello by the South African writer J.M. Coetzee. And I'm going to quote something very, very short from the novel, which is spoken by the protagonist, the central character, who is giving a lecture on the African novel at a conference on a cruise ship. The English novel, she says, is written in the first place by English people for English people. That is what makes it the English novel. The Russian novel is written by Russians for Russians. But the African novel is not written by Africans for Africans. African novelists may write about Africa, about African experiences, but they seem to me to be glancing over their shoulder all the time that they write at the foreigners who will read them. Whether they like it or not, they have accepted the role of interpreter, interpreting Africa to their readers. Yet how can you explore a world in all its depths if at the same time you are having to explain it? It is like a scientist trying to give full creative attention to his or her investigations, while at the same time explaining what he or she is doing to a class of students. It is too much for one person. It cannot be done, not at the deepest level. That, it seems to me, is the root of your problem, having to perform your Africanness at the same time you write it. I'm coming to the end. I want to say this as simply and clearly as possible. If the agenda of the school, whatever school, is transformational, if transformation is what the school intends to engage with, then the school must be transformational in every way possible, in the very fiber of what it does, what it says, how it acts, how it administrates, how it teaches, and what it values. Difference matters not because it is different, but because different viewpoints, different histories, and different experiences of the world contribute in rich, creative, and meaningful ways to scholarship and our shared understanding of what it means to be human. I want to be very clear on this point. Questions of identity, race, ethnicity, ancestry, heritage, and yes, even oppression matter because they add to scholarship. They do not detract from it. Difference, however it is constructed or conceived, enriches, matures, and deepens us. Sometimes it replaces outdated, racist, and irrelevant material, but I want to insist that the impetus for change must be one of generosity, not animosity. Being angry is only the first step in a long road to transform the academy, and in the process to transform ourselves. Fiction can sometimes represent social truths that are more searching, more questioning, and more truthful than facts will ever allow. I suppose I see architectural education as a kind of fiction, in the best possible sense of the word, a means of exploring difficult and complex questions about who we are and who we want to be. As students, academics, and practitioners, your work is your truth.
I've always used architectural softwares simply to the extent of how can I exploit them for an idea or concept.
The job of the academy is to protect the space in which those truths can be tried, tested, but above all, told. Thank you. Okay, thank you.
We try to stay standing. This is an important moment in the history of mankind, isn't it? So everything has to be a little bit serious, and I appreciate that. You have a very experimental and open approach to architecture, embracing the complexity of this subject. Do you find that there are areas where architecture cannot reach, or things that architecture cannot be?
It's a great question. I think I would say that over the past 5 years particularly, and I think that's partly to do with the pandemic, the protests, and now the threat of war, but 5 years in general, I've come to understand that my training as an architect did not give me tools, it rather gave me tactics. And when I think about the limits of architecture, I think at the moment we're in a kind of space where we have to push those tactics to the limits in order to find something new. So I don't say so much that architecture is ever expanding. I think there is a point at which something is no longer architectural. But I think the way we go about asking that question has nothing. There are no sacred cows. Everything is within reason. Yeah. And
it's complex, isn't it? And how do we embrace it in the educational situation where we are a little bit stuck in our traditional way of thinking of aesthetics and design?
Yeah, and I mean, I think, I studied a few other things before I came to architecture, and one of the reasons I was so drawn to it was because I thought I would know something in great depth. But actually, after 7 years, doing a PhD and everything, I understand now I know less than when I started. And that, I think, is the amazing thing about this discipline, that actually architects deal with complexity very, very well. And in some ways, the educational systems that I've been involved with over the past 20 years have been about taking out the complexity. I think actually it's about bringing it back in. And that's what we do better, I think, than most people. We know how to deal with things that don't appear as if they belong together. And that's
very important, to make it more clear, or to actually embrace the complexity and work with that, and not trying to simplify the subject just to get control of it.
Exactly, and that relationship between knowing something and controlling something, I think, is a fallacy. So there is something in the kind of Western approach to education that the more you know, the more you can control. And I think actually it's the opposite. It's the way you go about knowing something that in the end gives you the ability to deal with complexity. So yeah, it's time for change, but I also think change is not something to be fearful of.
It's also time to get educated. Never too late for anyone.
Shoot me. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you.